In 1933, Adolf Hitler was made Chancellor of Germany. This allowed the Nazi regime to seize complete power. The Wall Street crash, the Reichstag fire, and the death of Ernst von Rath all enabled the Nazis to further their tyranny. German military rearmament was prioritized, and in 1935, the Wehrmacht saw its reincarnation following the disarmament after World War I. Britain and France turned a blind eye to this contravention of the Versailles Treaty. The German people were excited by the prospect of the country becoming great again. Exploiting all aspects of the media, Joseph Goebbels masterminded the slick propaganda which was fed to the population.
Goebbels' great insight was that the best propaganda is disguised as something else. It's carried on the back of entertainment.
Coupled with this, the violent persecution of all those opposed to the regime became progressively worse.
A strong, powerful street presence, uniformed marching men and boys, and a lot of them. The repetitive power of violent, brutal street theatre when it came to dealing with opposition.
Terror played a very important part in the dictatorship throughout its entire length. No political dissent would be tolerated.
The Nazi Party delivered on their promise of higher employment, and although the German nation was not oblivious to the violence and persecution, they allowed it to continue in the hope that Hitler would restore their pride.
The only real long-term aims were to stay in power, win back territory for Germany, and to win back respect for Germany.
I knew there was a lot of unrest, but I didn't think it would blossom into all-out war.
The Second World War would see the height of Nazi popularity, but it would also be their ultimate downfall.
His idea is to refight the First World War, but on a better basis. His aim very early on is to conquer Eastern Europe.
Once it became clear that victory was not going to be easy, then a great many German people realized that this had been a gamble and that they'd lost.
He maintained his faith because it was a matter of will.
He'd come to believe that he was a Messiah blessed by providence. He just believed that there was something of the divine about him.
To fully understand the outbreak of World War II, we have to look back to 1936 and the start of the Nazi reoccupation of land lost from the Versailles Treaty.
One of the fundamental principles of the Treaty of Versailles had been national self-determination. Every nation should have its state. So the Habsburg monarchy being broken up, the Austrians, Hungarians, the Czechs, Yugoslavs, they got their own. Why should this be denied to the Germans?
Hitler certainly sets out an agenda for moving into the Rhineland, which had become a demilitarized zone under the terms of the Versailles Treaty.
German soldiers, again breaking a treaty, marched into the demilitarized Rhineland.
The Rhineland was sovereign German territory. It's a remilitarization. It's having military installations on it. It had been occupied up to 1930. The deal was that the Germans would have it under their own control, that the occupation forces would leave, but that there would be no military installations in it. 1936, of course, Hitler sends his troops into the Rhineland and big military show.
On March 12, 1938, the German army marched into Austria. They were met with cheering crowds as they crossed the border. Hitler's appeal was growing rapidly.
The Anschluss is popular with a lot of people in Austria, perhaps not as many as it looks, because the previous regime of Dollfuss and Schuschnigg had done the work for Hitler by banning the left in 1934. The Social Democrats had been banned. They were underground. So there's no opposition, really, in Austria either. I mean, it's a dictatorship as well.
Hitler said that he had no desire on any territory which had not had a historical memory of a German presence. The Germans were a pan-European tribe. They were not a nation in a country, as the rest of us really are. They were everywhere. They were not in the Iberian Peninsula, they were not in the British Isles, but they were everywhere else, stretching deep into Russia.
So there's no resistance in Europe to the German takeover of German-speaking Austria. The German demand for the incorporation of 2 million German speakers on the western boundaries of Czechoslovakia in 1938 is acceded to because it fulfills that principle.
On September 30th, 1938, Germany, France, Britain and Italy signed the Munich Agreement, which attempted to appease Hitler's designs on Czechoslovakia following the Anschluss of Austria.
Meanwhile at Munich, misguided statesmen were lulled into believing that Hitler would cage his stormtroopers in return for a sizable hunk of Czechoslovakia. They signed away the Sudetenland in a move to appease a rattlesnake who, having once glutted himself on the rich food of another nation's lands, would become ravenously hungry again and again.
The agreement handed Hitler the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia, which left the country weakened, and on March 16, 1939, Germany took control of the country.
I think it may be true that Hitler felt he had been cheated of his war over the Sudetenland. He had a peculiar hatred for the Czechs. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe it was just Czechs and Poles as Slavs. It seems as if he may have felt denied a war in the autumn of 1938, at a time when he felt his potential adversaries were too weak, really.
The remilitarization of the Rhineland, Anschluss of Austria in 1938, the Czechoslovak crisis, they're all solved basically without bloodshed. That gains Hitler a reputation and popularity in Germany, but not because he's being militaristic.
The sequence of territory gains made by the Nazis in the late 1930s won back the majority of land lost by the signing of the Versailles Treaty after the First World War.
Winning the foreign policy successes of the 1930s without having to resort to war was a major gain that was appreciated by a lot of people and restored German pride in a big way.
The turning point only comes in March 1939 when Hitler marches into the rest of Czechoslovakia, which is inhabited not by Germans but by Czechs. At that point, there's a general realization in political elites in other countries in Europe that he's after more than simply recreating a kind of German nation state.
Hitler gambled on the fact they'd get away with doing these things without war, and his gambling instinct served him well. Britain, France, the Western democracies did not respond militarily for all kinds of reasons. The real gamble was 1939, when it came to the move against Poland.
Signed in 1939 in Moscow, the Non-Aggression Pact would establish Nazi Germany and Russia as allies.
By then, he knew he could get away with it, or he did, by early August, after the extraordinary turnaround in the Reich's policy of signing a mutual non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. That was the moment at which the field was cleared for Hitler to move against Poland.
Germany invades Poland and the Free State of Danzig. The efforts and hopes of diplomats for peaceful settlement are transformed into the roar of gunfire. Warsaw is bombed, blasted and shelled. Poland is in ruin.
Where the gamble went wrong was that Britain and France honoured their treaty obligations to Poland. Hitler had never thought they would do that.
The eve of war was upon the German nation. It would be a conflict which would bring about the demise of the Nazi regime, but it would also facilitate mass genocide, brutal murder and bloodshed on a scale which no one could have imagined possible. Territory gains made by the Nazi regime were carried out with minimum of bloodshed and resistance. The German nation was buoyant. Their Führer was delivering.
War has struck again.
However, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. With regard to the Treaty of Versailles, this attack proved a step too far for Britain and the Allies.
I have to tell you now, this country is at war with Germany.
The Second World War had commenced.
The wrong of Versailles had been righted. They hadn't got Alsace-Lorraine back. They could live without them. The Polish corridor was the big issue territorially. They had that. They had Austria. People would have been very happy to leave it at that. But the war was not concluded. And you do get complaints, even in the autumn of 1939. This war has been going on too long.
In the winter of 1939, Hitler would unleash his blitzkrieg upon Western Europe, and over the following months, Germany would go on to conquer many more countries.
One victory after another, the fall of France, the fall of Belgium, the fall of Holland, the fall of Norway. All of this is a kind of ecstasy.
I think the euphoria is partly that now it really is all over, and we've done really well. People were pretty pleased with that, and Hitler, it had been done under his leadership, so he got a lot of credit for that.
The prophet is what he says he is. He is real. He is an earthly god by this stage. And of course, the trouble is he begins to believe his own mythology.
Very rapid conquest with relatively little bloodshed, not much loss on the German side, very short war. All of this was treated with huge enthusiasm by the German people, partly because they then thought the war would come to an end.
That was certainly enough for the overwhelming majority of Germans.
I think that all those crowds you see in the newsfields waving flags and screaming, it's all true. I mean, they couldn't believe it, that in a few weeks they defeated an enemy they couldn't defeat in 4 years of grueling war.
Hitler was one of the few people in Germany who welcomed another war. He wasn't scared. The First World War had made him somebody. But for other Germans, 2 million German men had been killed during the First World War, and an awful lot had been wounded. You just had to look at the maimed ex-servicemen on the streets. So it was a terrible prospect for an awful lot of people.
In a drive as speedy as that to the Channel, Nazi units pushed southward and rapidly outflanked the famous French Maginot Line.
Following the French surrender, Hitler arranged for the armistice between Germany and France to be signed in the same train carriage in the same location which 22 years previously had been used for the signing of the armistice of 1918. Reaching the English Channel in May 1940 and outmaneuvering the British, causing the retreat to Dunkirk, the German army looked to be the far superior aggressor. Britain was on the brink of seeking terms with Germany, but Winston Churchill argued that nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished.
Hitler gave a rather empty speech offering peace terms which weren't very specified to Britain. And when Churchill rejected them, there was universal outrage and incomprehension in Germany. Churchill knew that a peace with Germany at that point would mean German control over Britain would get greater and greater. He would probably be ousted. Fascists like Mosley would become the prime minister. That it would be, in effect, a surrender in stages. He was quite right to reject this very vague peace offer.
But an interesting aspect of this is his view of Churchill, whom he respected as a fellow artist. And for a long time, his plan for Churchill in the event of German victory was to just leave him in a country house where he could paint and not string him up like all the others or put him in a concentration camp.
Trying to bomb Britain into submission over the winter of 1940-1941 was a huge miscalculation. They did not have the offensive air power to do it.
Hello, America. This is Edward Murrow speaking from London. There were more German planes over the coast of Britain today than at any time since the war began. Anti-aircraft guns were in action along the southeast coast today.
Fought in the air, the Battle of Britain would start on July 10th and would finish on October 31st, 1940.
I was speaking to Captain Erich Braun, who interrogated Goering, that Goering at Nuremberg told him that the Battle of Britain was a draw.
I said to him, "What are your views on the outcome of the Battle of Britain?" And he said, "I think it was a draw." And I said, "How did you arrive at that conclusion?" He said, "Well, if you look at the analysis of the final weeks of the Battle of Britain, the last week we were in the ascendancy. In other words, we had less pilot and aircraft casualties than the Brits." Now, if you look at the analysis, this is perfectly true.
Although the British had claimed victory, Hitler's popularity within Germany was still strong. The Nazi commanders were all firmly behind Hitler. However, on May 10th, 1940, one would take action which would signal fractures within the regime.
Hitler retained his charismatic control over the second rank of Nazi leaders, Goering, Goebbels, and so on, during the war. Hess was the only exception because he was really eased out of the central decision-making circles of Nazism and thought he'd try and get back in a rather muddle-headed way.
One of the great mysteries of World War II, there is some speculation as to whether Hitler in fact authorized it, because if we take Hitler as actually wanting a negotiated peace with Britain, not a conquest, it would actually make sense.
In the most bizarre and astounding event of the war so far, Rudolf Hess, number 3 Nazi, seen here going about his activities as confidant and chief party leader for the Nazi warlord Hitler, is now a prisoner in Scotland after a mysterious solo flight from Germany.
Hess had simply got into his head, but to restore his status with Hitler, he would fly to Britain and negotiate a peace.
It was very easy for the Nazi media to project Hess as deluded. Indeed, what he did was remarkable. Firstly, he learned to fly, specifically for this purpose.
The Nazi leader took off from Augsburg and headed straight for western Scotland, where an old friend of his, the Duke of Hamilton, has an estate. His mission? Who knows?
He flew and crash-landed on the estate of the Duke of Hamilton in Scotland. The choice of landing was significant because Hamilton had actually been very sympathetic to Germany before the war, and some suggested a kind of crypto-fascist himself. But by this stage, he's very anxious to clean up his act. So he delivers Hess straight to the authorities.
Hitler was furious because, of course, he didn't know about it. Furious, particularly because it was just before the invasion of the Soviet Union.
As Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine were covering themselves from the Hess debacle, Hitler was implementing the start of another battle. Led by arrogance and self-belief, he would soon embark on the largest invasion in the history of warfare. The attack would stretch along a 3,000-kilometer front and would send 4 million soldiers into Soviet territory. It would mark the beginning of the pivotal phase in deciding the victory of the war, which would see Nazi popularity plummet in Germany. It would bring death and destruction to millions of people. (1940) had seen the height of Hitler and the Nazi regime's popularity within Germany. The Battle of Britain had been unsuccessful, but support was still strong, despite Hess's flight to Scotland. What would come next, however, would be a battle led by prejudice and vanity on the part of Hitler. His own self-belief convinced him to march on Moscow and conquer Russia, the very campaign that Charles XII and Napoleon had failed to achieve.
In a sudden coup, Germany's military might has been thrown against her former ally, Russia, in a gigantic attack by land as well as by air, along a 2,000-mile front from the Arctic to the Black Sea.
At first, he was lucky. His self-confidence paid off. Took the Rhineland and walked into Austria All that built up his self-confidence, not only with the people, but with himself. This was the dangerous thing.
There were two reasons why Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. First of all, it was a way of bringing Britain to terms, because he thought already in 1940 that he wasn't going to conquer Britain by force. He was going to have to leave Britain totally isolated without any allies at all. And if he conquered the Soviet Union, the British surely would see sense they'd have the entire continent against them.
Secondly, his derision of the Bolsheviks, them being inherently incompetent, and his racial dismissal of the Russians. He believed it would collapse like a house of cards.
The Bolshevik state was rotten to the core. You had only to kick the door in and the whole edifice would come crumbling down. That's what they thought. And I think, flushed with success from the Blitzkrieg in Western Europe, they thought all they had to do was attack. In a way, it was a bit silly, actually, because that had been the mentality of 1914.
With a bit of luck, if he had gone earlier, he may have succeeded in temporarily conquering Russia.
Today, American news agencies report Russia is strongly counterattacking, and that less than 1/50th of Russia's vast area has been invaded. These pictures show then the beginning of the Blitz that turned into a siege.
There was some encouragement in that Stalin had done a great deal of damage to his armed forces through the purges of the mid-later 1930s.
But how Hitler would ever police it for the rest of his time, I don't think he'd even begun to think it through.
Panzer troops in action. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, great clashes between Russian and German tank squadrons have been reported.
In the autumn of 1941, the Germans were on course, just cutting through butter, going to take Moscow, going to take Leningrad. And they didn't, and they were stopped.
Operation Barbarossa would be a definitive turning point in the fortunes of the Nazi regime. The march on Moscow was the end of what had started as a successful campaign. Hitler had gained many territories in Eastern Europe, but it was the harsh Soviet winter and the tough belligerence of the Red Army that would finally see the Nazis defeated and home support of the regime finally turn.
Here, apparently, the Germans got their first sight of the Russian scorched earth tactics. Scorched earth tactics that American reporters say should be even more effective now that winter has set in. And Hitler's photogenic army must face General Snow and General Mud.
Once you get into 1942, they're now fighting on quite a number of fronts. Army leave is being cancelled, so people aren't getting home. Food rationing is getting more stringent. People are becoming depressed and disillusioned.
It was not just the German population who were becoming despondent. Many officers in the German army were also starting to question their Führer's actions.
Throughout the war, there were attempts to assassinate Hitler, many of them orchestrated by anti-Hitler generals and soldiers, but none of them manage it.
All the former Social Democrats and Communists, I say a third of the electorate in the last free election, 1932, they had effectively been brought in line, their resistance movements, mostly distributing leaflets and kind of keep the flame going, as it were, they'd all been suppressed by the Gestapo.
It was very difficult to resist in the Third Reich because denunciation was widespread. If somebody overheard you or got a clue that you were doing X, Y, and Z, then they would go down to Gestapo headquarters and turn you in.
So the only people who could really resist as a group were the senior army officers with a few conservative politicians attached. And they're the ones who then prepared the assassination of Hitler as things were beginning to go really seriously wrong in 1943 to 4.
Klaus von Stauffenberg was a general in the German army who had been injured serving in North Africa, losing his right hand, 2 fingers on the left, and also his left eye.
Von Stauffenberg was the most unlikely assassin. He'd been seriously injured. He could prime the bomb only with great difficulty and so on, but nobody else could be found to do it. And he was determined now that his German patriotism could only be expressed by destroying Hitler. Hitler would destroy Germany. If you were a patriot, your job was to destroy Hitler.
Although the bomb von Stauffenberg detonated killed 4 people, Hitler was shielded by a solid oak table and was only left with minor injuries. Von Stauffenberg was found guilty of high treason and subsequently executed. Having survived the assassination attempt, Adolf Hitler was still convinced that the war was for winning, even though the German nation suspected the worst.
He's always hoping, when he looks back at history, that something will happen. Something will happen politically. The alliance will fall apart, or Germany will invent an amazing new weapon. But somehow or other you can pluck victory from the jaws of defeat, just as his great hero Frederick the Great had done. I'm not sure there's ever a point, actually, at which Hitler says, I recognize it, I failed, we're going to be defeated.
The battle on the Eastern Front turned into a long war of attrition. The German army was ill-prepared for this, and the Russian army, with the far greater resource, would in 1944 finally defeat the attacking German army. The paradox of the attack eastwards was that the more territory Hitler gained, greater was the Jewish population he acquired.
The war changed everything, and Germany's victories across Europe and then in the East after June 1941, from having a population of 600,000 Jews in 1933, the number of Jewish people under the Reich's, in inverted commas, administrative military control soared to many millions of people.
Hitler's problem, self-inflicted problem, is he attacks Poland and the largest concentration of European Jews falls into his hands. And as he moves elsewhere in Eastern Europe, more Jews come under his rule. The original idea had been to expel German Jews from Germany, and Jews were expelled into Poland, for example. But that doesn't solve the problem once you've invaded Poland.
The Madagascar Plan was an idea to establish a Jewish colony on the African island of Madagascar. It was subsequently shelved in 1942.
I don't think anybody ever asked Madagascar to settle a Jewish colony there, to ship out European Jews, but that was, I think, was never really going to come to anything.
There had been talk about enforced deportations of a captive Jewish population out of Germany, out of Europe. How were they going to do that? That, by its very nature, would have been a brutal, murderous exercise.
The Wannsee Conference was a meeting of Nazi officials in Wannsee, a suburb of Berlin, to establish a final solution to the Jewish problem.
They formalized the operation of the Holocaust while it was already underway, while it had already started. People like Eichmann, Heydrich showed up to take the decisions in a chillingly managerial way. No need for Hitler to be present. They didn't need him. They knew Hitler would sanction what they were going to do.
The extermination camps would eventually operate around the clock. In the last acts of this brutal conflict, Adolf Hitler would unleash one final command that would order the futile resistance of his party faithful. War on the Eastern Front was a battle too far. It signaled the end for the Nazi regime. The German nation was heavily rationed, and those dwelling in the urban centres were facing ever-increasing bombing raids by the Allied forces. Hitler, however, remained defiant.
Late on, Hitler lived in a fantasy world of his own. Even in the last days of the war, he was conjuring up in his own mind imaginary armies, secret weapons, extraordinary make-believe scenarios.
He maintained his faith because it was a matter of will. The 1934 party rally was called Triumph of the Will. And Hitler and Goebbels, to a very great extent, and some other close followers, maintained this belief that their will would prevail.
Nobody had the nerve to try to disabuse Hitler of his fantasies, even in the last days.
In the autumn of 1944, a group of generals come to Hitler's headquarters. The generals go in and say to Hitler, "We are convinced that the war is lost." They're in there for about, I don't know, an hour and a half or something. And they come out again, their eyes shining, saying, "The Führer has convinced us that we can win the war."
By then, he'd already decided that the German people had betrayed him. They had proved unworthy of their great destiny and deserved the fate that was descending upon them. Extraordinary mental and moral universe to inhabit.
June 6, 1944 saw the D-Day landings and would be the start of the Allied invasion of occupied Western Europe. Germany found they were retreating from all fronts as the Red Army marched from the east. Close to defeat, Hitler issued what became known as the Nero Decree. On March 19, 1945, an order was sent out that all German infrastructures must be destroyed to prevent the Allies utilizing them as they advanced. It also called for every last house and street to be fought for.
It happened. In small villages which had nothing to do with the war, they had to stand and fight when American tanks came, that kind of thing. It just was absolutely criminal.
So he blamed reverses and defeats on the lack of willpower in his generals, not on the lack of material or the superiority of the enemy.
It had terrible repercussions for Germans because it meant that the whole of Germany had to be invaded, fought over, occupied by foreign troops in a way that had not happened in the First World War because Hitler wouldn't surrender.
In the closing stages of the war, a large number of the Nazi faithful realized that the war was effectively lost. This resulted in mass suicides throughout Germany.
There's this feeling of Gotterdammerung, the twilight of the gods. We all die together because life after the Reich isn't worth living. Now, that's an extraordinary sensation. And I think one can't fully explain it. You have to understand the extraordinarily rigid hold the regime had on people.
A great many of the party faithful committed suicide because they simply couldn't face the idea of German defeat. They'd been fed propaganda for years that defeat would mean the partition of Germany, it might mean the deliberate impoverishment. There were rumors that all German males would be castrated, and all kinds of extraordinary things went around in 1945.
Historians have tried to quantify the numbers, but in the ghastly chaos of the Third Reich in its final days, mass murder, nihilistic orgies of killing by the Nazi state in its death throes, it's hard to know what the actual figures really were.
Knowing that the Soviets were advancing swiftly towards his bunker, Hitler gave his last will and testament, making Joseph Goebbels as Reich Chancellor and naming no one as his successor as Führer. The next day, April 30th, 1945, Hitler shot himself.
Two of Hitler's immediate circle, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, remained loyal to him right to the end. They stayed in the bunker in Berlin. For Goebbels, there was nowhere else to go. He felt that if the Third Reich collapsed, if Hitler was killed, that was it. Everything was over.
An extraordinary sense of apocalypse seemed to overtake them, and they felt that that was the only course of action open to them.
On May 1st, Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda committed suicide, but before doing so, killed their 6 children by drugging them and then poisoning them with cyanide. Both Himmler and Goering would commit suicide as well, but this was not before they were interrogated by the Allies. Captain Erich Braun, posted to Germany to look for jet wind tunnels, was tasked with the job of identifying Himmler and was able to interrogate Goering. Himmler was arrested near the Danish border with false papers.
The warrant officer phoned headquarters at Lüneburg and said, "We've picked up somebody who we think might be Himmler. Could you come up and identify him? You said when you saw Himmler in civil life that he used to walk with a slightly peculiar gait. And could you come up and try and identify this guy?" So I went up to Barnstedt. As soon as I walked in, I knew it was Himmler. I mean, even without making him walk. Absolute coward. I think he was frightened out of his life, always trying to evade anything that directly threatened him.
Accompanied by these two SS men, Heinrich Himmler, most hated man in Europe, was captured by British troops outside this town. Concealed in Himmler's mouth was a tiny vial of deadly poison. While being examined, he swallowed it.
Goering was in American custody, and Erich was able to ask him key questions about Nazi aircraft strategy.
He was charismatic, very intelligent. He came out of World War I with great honor, had a huge reputation in Germany, a good man who went very long. He was corrupted by the system he joined, and he lost all his qualities of honor and began to really lust for power and luxury. And that, of course, was his total downfall.
At Lüneburg, Germany, before a British military court, the greatest mass murder trial in history. These Nazis were guards at notorious Belsen concentration camp, where 4 million prisoners died.
The end of the war signaled the beginning of peace for many across Europe and the rest of the world. There was a tangible sense of relief in the air, but as occupied land was liberated, the full horror of the Nazi regime was revealed. Erich Braun was part of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen.
Piles of dead bodies, piles of walking dead, really. Just a horror story.
Now Belsen, the human slaughterhouse where numberless victims were once burned to death, is itself put to the torch. Nearby, Nazi women guards are lined up for questioning.
He wanted me to interrogate the camp commandant, who was called Josef Kramer, and the lady camp commandant, Irma Grese.
Kramer's chief sadist was Irma Grese, in curls, whose name struck terror into the hearts of Belsen's inmates.
She's the worst human being I've ever met. Cruelty was her trade. There was nothing too cruel for this woman to do. When it came to interrogating her, I asked her if she had her time over again, would she do all this? She refused to answer. After about 4 or 5 times like this, she suddenly leapt to her feet and gave the Nazi salute, shouted Heil Hitler, sat down and refused to talk. But we executed the lot. You can hardly defend yourself when outside the window there's a pile of bodies as high as the ceiling in a pit.
Newsreel films of the atrocities at Belsen shocked the world. Even death for Kramer and his gang cannot avenge the crimes of the beasts of Belsen.
What started as Hitler's strong anti-Semitic beliefs in the wake of World War I ended as what we now know as the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were murdered, along with tens of thousands of gypsies, homosexuals, communists, mentally ill, and the physically disabled. In the aftermath of the war, the Allied forces would soon stake their own territorial claims, which would leave the conquered nation divided.
Germany in 1945 was an extraordinary mess. 60% of its urban area had been obliterated from the air.
Germany was occupied by the Allied powers, the Soviet Union, the French, British and Americans, very heavy military occupation.
It was economically impoverished. It was difficult to see, in fact, in 1945, where Germany was going to go, how Germans were going to survive. Widespread hunger, even starvation in places.
There were all kinds of measures to stop any recrudescence of Nazism. Nazi laws are revoked. There's a re-education effort of trying to educate Germans in the evils of Nazism. But in a sense, that's all less important than the fact that Nazism had brought, in the end, nothing but death and destruction.
After the war, the nation of Germany would be split in two. To the east, the Soviet-occupied area became the German Democratic Republic. The area to the west, which Britain, France and the US occupied, became the Federal Republic of Germany. This division was most notably illustrated in Berlin. The Berlin Wall was erected in 1961 and would be a chilling visual reminder of a nation divided.
I was sent back to Germany in the mid-1950s. I found it difficult to reform relationship with some of them, whom I knew what they had done in the war. But in general, I realized that some of them had been led like sheep to the slaughter.
I think post-war Germany is a great epic in the act of remembrance and admission. For a nation to confront its guilt like that is extraordinary, because a lot of other nations have a lot of other skeletons in the cupboard.
Hitler remains a source of intrigue for many people throughout the world.
Hitler exerts a kind of fascination that you could never really imagine. We spend so much time writing books about programs about Hitler and so on. I think Hitler would have been amazed by the extent of historical attention that's paid to him.
You'll always get young bloods who will be attracted to the style of the Nazi regime.
They've actually given us the image not of themselves, but of their ideal.
It is an extraordinary story, how this nondescript man, stateless, radical politician with a whole lot of wacky ideas in the 1920s could suddenly become Germany's dictator, then unleash the largest war and embark on the biggest crime the world has ever known. And I think that the public, 70 years on, is still fascinated by those paradoxes.
Today, Germany is a nation united. The economic miracle that West Germany experienced in the 1950s, supported by the Marshall Plan, gave them the basis to develop a strong economy and political stability. The real miracle, however, should be credited to the people of Germany. By confronting their own brutal history, they have allowed the world to learn from the mistakes made in their past. Although persecution, hatred and war are still a global problem, Germany has sanctioned its history to be used as the marker of a cruelty which should never again be repeated. World War I had left Germany in a state of shock. 2 million fatalities, spiraling inflation, and unpaid debts to the Allied countries caused the nation to feel stripped of its identity and pride.
They felt that the Allies had deceived them, had abandoned all notions of honor by treating them as a conquered people.
Hitler was a war hero. He won the Iron Cross First Class. The First World War turned a nobody into a somebody.
Adolf Hitler had survived the conflict and found a political home in the German Workers' Party, a right-wing organization with racist and anti-Semitic roots.
Hitler, like many others, had to find some way of explaining it to himself. And like tens of thousands of others, he blamed socialists, Marxists, Jews, people who undermined Germany from within.
Climbing the ranks, he changed the name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party and took control.
He was fulfilling a prefigured role which had always existed in German history and culture, the man who would deliver Germany from her enemies.
As leader, he started plotting the takeover of Munich and in turn Germany. The infamous beer hall putsch was a resounding failure.
It was built up into an iconic episode in the history of the movement.
Hitler was arrested, put on trial.
Hitler was later imprisoned. His intentions, however, were still for total power and to return the nation to a state of pride. Hitler knew that he would need a different approach.
First of all, he had to get the army, police, the civil service and business on his side. And secondly, he had to develop a propaganda apparatus which would win votes.
If we can't outshoot them, we'll outvote them. And we'll do it by winning support.
He would fuse violent acts of terror with slick propaganda, which would all fuel this fatal attraction. In the late 1920s, the Nazi Party found themselves with diminishing support as the German economy became stronger.
In 1928, Germany was in quite reasonable circumstances. There had been a recovery from the depression after the war, recovery from the inflation with the stabilization of the currency in 1924. The economy appeared to be booming. This was largely because there was an enormous influx of American money. The Germans spent a lot of the loan money on things that were very desirable, like concert halls and swimming pools and so on, but they weren't productive. So Germany looked as if it was prospering.
Unforeseen events in the world economy would end up having huge ramifications for Germany.
Post-war economic recovery under the Weimar Republic, which was genuine enough while it lasted, that had collapsed. That had gone into free fall as a direct result of the Wall Street crash in New York.
October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. The New York Stock Exchange is in a panic. Frantic investors have scrambled to unload their stocks at any price. Everyone wants to sell. No one wants to buy. Suddenly, even the most gilt-edged securities are practically valueless. The stock market crash has come, and the Great Depression has begun.
They just pulled the rug out from Germany. They just withdrew their investments.
American banks withdrew the loans on which a German recovery after the hyperinflation of 1923 had depended. German banks collapsed. They withdrew their money from businesses. Businesses collapsed.
So many of the loans, particularly, had been made on a 14-day basis. They could just withdraw them. So the German economy contracted very suddenly, very quickly.
Every European country was affected. Germany was disastrously affected.
There was a saying of the time, New York sneezed, London caught cold, and Germany nearly died of influenza. It really was, first and foremost, a crisis of industrial society. And the major unemployment was in industry, particularly the building trade.
By 1932, there was 35 to 40% unemployment in Germany.
That is how catastrophic the Depression was. When you throw manual workers out of jobs, of course, the people who are the clerks in these occupations suffer as well.
The continuity of the Great Depression was absolutely critical. And once you got the worker in the dole queue, you had him as a potential Nazi, a potential stormtrooper.
The people of Germany were down and out, and the now called National Socialist Party had found a cause to champion that would increase their visibility and popularity.
In that atmosphere of crisis, when governments were only able to rule by decree because the parties couldn't get together and get behind a policy to deal with this massive economic collapse. In that situation, voters thought, this is the last straw. We've had hyperinflation, we've had international humiliation, we've got political chaos. The Nazis seem to be the one party that's led by youthful, determined, energetic individuals.
They promoted the party, actually, in 1930 particularly, as the Hitler movement, die Hitlerbewegung. This, of course, was after Hitler had had the ban on his public speaking lifted, and so he had been going around speaking a great deal.
It's very difficult to find anything to which the party was willing to commit itself.
They were very, very vague on what they intended to do. They seemed to have to offer something to every constituency in Germany, the worker, the manager, the lower middle class, women.
What he was saying in one place wasn't necessarily compatible with what he was saying elsewhere, in terms of, say, economic detail.
We're going to make Germany great again, we're going to recover, we're going to have work for everybody, we'll put Germany back on the international scene, we're going to rescue the German family, we'll give German women a much better life. These are all cliches. And when you probe, they really don't have any particular policies that they can actually present in a rational way to the general public.
Much of it rested simply on that Germany will be rescued, Germany will become a great power, and Hitler will be the person to achieve it.
Electoral success would come to the Nazis at the beginning of the 1930s, and their popularity continued to rise as the population grew more disillusioned with the established government.
I think that the electoral success of Hitler's party in 1932 didn't necessarily reflect the strengths of the party itself or its ideological appeal. It really reflected the extraordinary crisis that Germany had gone through as a result of the Wall Street crash. And I think what a lot of German people did was they desperately looked around for some kind of messiah. And that's how Hitler was being sold to the public.
Their appeal was many-sided, and of course, their vision was of what they called a Volksgemeinschaft, a folk community, in which the party could represent all social classes and groups.
Hitler stands for election as president in April 1932 against Hindenburg, who had been president since 1925. And he loses, but he comes second, he comes a pretty creditable second, and it's given him a much higher profile than he'd previously had. The propaganda continues, and in the election of July 1932, the Nazi Party gets 37% of the vote, and is the largest single party in the Reichstag with 230 seats, more than doubling its 1930 total. That's a tremendous success, but Hitler is not offered the chancellorship. Actually, it was his democratic right to be offered the chancellorship, but he is not. He is offered the vice-chancellorship, and he turns it down.
A large proportion of the middle class voted for the National Socialist Party in the July elections of 1932 as a protest to the Hindenburg government. By November, they had retracted their support.
There is another election in November, and the Nazi vote declines to 33%. Still, I think, 196 seats in the Reichstag. But it's a matter of considerable disappointment to a lot of followers.
So what they do, they seem to be on the verge of their death cough, their death rattle.
There is now not such a pressing need to offer Hitler the chancellorship. Local election votes and so on at the time are showing a decline in the Nazi vote. I mean, they might just have fizzled out.
There is then a minor election in the state of Lippe, and what the Nazis do is flood it with their marketing resource. They throw everything at this miniature state of Lippe, and they win. And it's at that point that Hindenburg finally invites Hitler to be part of a coalition government.
The small coterie of conservative politicians decided they could manipulate Hitler, offered him a chancellorship, and that was the start.
Adolf Hitler, leader of the German national movement, is made Chancellor of Germany, and Berlin goes wild in celebration of his victory.
Having secured the role as Reich Chancellor, it took one more twist of fate in favor of the National Socialists to see the future of Germany take a deadly turn and hand Hitler complete control. The Wall Street crash had sent Germany into economic crisis. The nation was subjected to a second wave of spiraling inflation and soaring unemployment. However, it gave the National Socialist Party the means to win a large proportion of the vote in a relatively short space of time. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Reich Chancellor. His plan of total power was almost tangible. 4 weeks later, on February 27, 1933, at 9:25 p.m., an alarm call was taken in a Berlin fire station. Fire had broken out in the Reichstag building, the home of the German parliament. By 11:30 p.m., the fire was extinguished, but had left the building a gutted shell. On searching the smouldering ruin, a young Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was found. He was arrested for starting the fire. According to police, he acted out of rebellion, a call for the German workers to rise up against the oppression of fascism. The Nazis saw the Communist Party as a huge threat to National Socialism, and also knew that a large proportion of the German population was suspicious of the far left.
Stalin having come to power, late 1920s, you have the first five-year plan in 1928, you have collectivization starting in 1929. Word gets back about what it means. And the last thing German peasants want is collectivization. A lot of German peasants, a lot of smallholders, they don't want collectivization, neither do the big landowners.
The fire allowed Hitler to pass two sets of legislation, the first of which was the Reichstag Fire Decree. This was drawn up the day after the incident and signed by President Hindenburg. The decree allowed the enforced imprisonment of anyone opposed to the Nazi regime, and action to be taken against any publication deemed critical of the cause. The decree led to the Enabling Act, passed in Parliament on March 23, 1933. It gave the Nazi Party power to enforce laws without the intervention of the Reichstag. Passing of the Enabling Act essentially handed power to Hitler and the National Socialist Party. They immediately let it be known throughout Germany. Fritz Lustig, a Jewish emigrant who now resides in North London, was living in Berlin in 1933.
I was born in 1919. I had a very happy childhood. I was the youngest of four siblings, and I had a very happy time at school, although I experienced the Nazis coming to power. We were rehearsing for a play at school, and suddenly we heard martial music sounding, and we looked out of the window, and there was a Nazi demonstration passing with lit torches and a band at the head of the procession. We read in the papers the next day that there had been similar processions all over Berlin, and we just had been happening to watch the one which took place in that particular part of town.
The national election of March 1933 saw the National Socialist Party take 43% of the vote, but they still failed to win a majority. Unbeknownst to the German population, this would be the last democratic election until World War II.
So people still thought in March, April 1933 that the democratic system was not dead, but it was. We look at it backwards. We can see what happened. And people even say, why did all these people vote for a party that unleashed war and genocide? Well, they didn't know that's what they were going to do.
The Nazis had taken Germany by lawful means. Hitler's plan had worked, and although his party had still not managed to gain a majority, they had total power. They believed there was still an enemy who may stand in the way of this domination that would come from within the party itself. The termination of this enemy would culminate on July 2nd, 1934. The incident, known as the Night of the Long Knives, would see the murder of Ernst Röhm, the head of the Sturmabteilung.
Hitler and the party leadership had arrived at the point where they felt they had to take on the SA, the Sturmabteilung.
Various senior paladins of the Reich feared the power of Rome. They coveted it for themselves, specifically Himmler. And so they began to tell Hitler that Rome was plotting against him, which was not in fact true. The army hated them because they're a rival source of power.
I think from Hitler's point of view, the real problem was that he was worried that Rome really would develop a popular following, more popular perhaps in the end than the following for Hitler. There was a real distrust about Rome's motives and Rome's political ambitions.
Major Rome is very definitely number two to Hitler, and therefore is some sort of potential rival to his power.
And they had a ready-made weapon, and that was the SS, the Schutzstaffel.
The SS were originally a small battalion of the much larger SA, but in 1929, Heinrich Himmler was appointed leader and, taking inspiration from Röhm, began to rapidly expand the unit. Initially, they were Hitler's bodyguard, but by 1933, after the seizure of power, it became the internal security of the Nazi regime.
By 1934, they were growing into a real and formidable private army, equipped famously with their black uniforms, black helmets, with their own weaponry. And they did much of the business when Hitler decided it was time to move against the SA.
Using falsified evidence, Himmler had assembled a file which cited that Röhm had been paid 12 million Deutschmarks by France to overthrow Hitler. In addition to this, Röhm's homosexuality was used as a way of discrediting him. He and others in the SA leadership were accused of acts of drunkenness and debauchery. This was used as a way of excusing the action which Hitler was about to take.
So it was an easy matter to set them up with allegations of internal corruption, particularly of homosexuality, and it was a chance to settle a lot of old scores.
On the morning of June 30th, Hitler, with a large number of SS, marched into the hotel in Bad Wiessee, where Röhm and many leaders of the SA were staying. They were arrested at gunpoint and later executed.
It was a brutal business when the move was made. The SA were taken totally by surprise, and much of their leadership was wiped out.
With the brutal execution of Röhm and other potential opponents, Hitler sent a clear message to all that opposition would not be tolerated. The Jewish population and those on the left were already living with constant persecution, yet the Nazi Party's popularity amongst the German nation grew. The threat of violence, intelligent propaganda, and the complete monopoly of all institutions in Germany gave people no choice but to support. The National Socialist Party had not won a majority in any of the elections of the early 1930s. However, the passing of the Enabling Act saw Hitler gain complete control of Germany. In turn, the Night of the Long Knives had killed off any potential political threat he may have had. The German nation found themselves living under a dictatorship. Jews, communists, social democrats were all targeted as enemies of the state. Persecution, imprisonment, and systematic execution were all threats to these members of society. Working closely with Hitler, it was Joseph Goebbels who saw to it that the veneer of the Nazi Party would appeal to the masses. This campaign intensified once power had been consolidated, but its roots were set long before.
The self-image that they wanted to create was of a movement of youth.
The existing politicians were all in their 50s and 60s. The Nazis were in their 20s and 30s.
The embodiment of all the energies of a new Germany, a new uncorrupted generation.
The one party that's led by youthful, determined, energetic individuals.
The Hitlerjugend, or Hitler Youth, were the personification of the Nazi image and gave the National Socialists a vibrant, youthful image.
Because Hitler believes that too much education is dangerous, the young Nazi gets his only schooling after working hours. A daily lecture on Germany's need for expansion and the triumph he will share when German armies march into the rich wheat fields of the Russian Ukraine.
The Hitler Youth eventually became almost compulsory. The Nazis market them very, very heavily. In other words, what we'd imagine them to be as a rigidly hierarchical organization with cruel discipline and bullying and so forth is not actually how they're self-presented. They're actually self-presented as a kind of adventure holiday.
At 18, every young man must serve 6 months in the Arbeitsdienst.
There was one boy in my form whom I quite liked, who was in the Hitler Youth. I was very keen on associating with him. I think he was less keen to associate with me.
The man who was first given charge of it, Baldur von Schirach, was an able organizer, good at recruiting, but the real takeoff was only after the Nazis took power. Within 18 months, they were able to claim 3.5 million members. And that doesn't count, of course, the women's and girls' organizations that were set up in parallel to it.
The girls' organization was called Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls.
A lot of young people who gravitated to the Hitler movement actually then influenced their parents, not the other way around.
It wasn't just youth groups that were monopolized by the Nazi Party. All organizations were in turn affected.
The Nazis forced every single voluntary society or organization in Germany to join the Nazi Party or become part of a Nazi apparatus. That meant all orchestras, opera houses, singing clubs, amateur dramatic societies, all of that, they had to become part of the Reich Chamber of Culture, which is under the propaganda ministry. And of course, if you wanted to practice art and exhibit your work, you had to be admitted to the Chamber of Culture. And if you're Jewish, you wouldn't be admitted. If you're a modern artist, you wouldn't be admitted. So this is a way of imposing control.
All aspects of life were effectively taken over by the National Socialists. These changes were witnessed by the schoolchild Fritz Lustig.
We had a new headmaster. Our current headmaster was not Jewish, but he was a social democrat, and therefore his politics were not acceptable to the Nazis. And a new headmaster was appointed. He introduced several new measures. One of them was that the weekly Monday morning assembly was completely transformed. After everybody had sat down, one of the boys who was stationed at the entrance door shouted, "Achtung, attention," and then the headmaster walked in along the central aisle all through the hall with his arm outstretched in the Hitler salute, turned smartly round when he reached the podium, shouted "Heil Hitler," and the whole school had to answer with the same. I suppose I must have outstretched my hand in the Hitler salute because not to do that would have drawn attention to me. I didn't want to draw attention to myself by raising the question of whether I was excluded.
Today, the Nazi propaganda machine is seeking to make Adolf Hitler the only god of the German people, out to destroy every established religion.
As the party took control of all areas of society and permeated into the lives of every German citizen, the need for greater, more effective propaganda became paramount.
There was nothing which wasn't propaganda of one sort or another. Every surface was interrogated for its propaganda potential.
The press was censored, and Nazi newspapers really had the lion's share of circulation.
The Volksempfänger, the People's Radio, was an affordable device manufactured on the orders of Joseph Goebbels. More people owning radios meant a larger audience for propaganda.
The propaganda barrage, to confuse, to make them lose faith, to divide and conquer. To lull the fears of the little neutrals, Propaganda Minister Goebbels told them Germany didn't want a war at all. It was Britain and France that caused all the trouble.
Radio was taken over, and there was a Reich broadcasting company, and radio, of course, was dominated completely by state output. 70% of German homes owned a radio by 1939.
There were loudspeakers installed on lampposts and on trees, and when any of these speeches took place, of course, you were expected to stand still and listen to them.
Film production was taken over by the Nazis as well.
Joseph Goebbels was very much aware of the fact that people would get bored very quickly if they were subjected to a constant barrage of propaganda about how wonderful the Nazis were. He was rather upset when Hitler commissioned a propaganda film of the Nuremberg Party Rally of 1934 from a young actress, Leni Riefenstahl.
Triumph of the Will was a film directed by Leni Riefenstahl, which documents the 1934 Nuremberg Rally. Its main themes are unity and returning power to Germany. It was no mistake that Nazi symbolism and imagery are prominent throughout the film. Hitler understood the power of the Nazi brand.
You actually have a core brand symbol system. You have, obviously, the swastika, you have the stylized eagle. You have the other things like the oak leaves, the acorns. Then, of course, there's the uniforms. I once counted up the number of uniforms in Nazi Germany, there are about 150. These uniforms are highly symbolic. For example, the SS uniforms were vaguely modeled on the Death's Head Hussars of German history, which was a black uniform with the skull and crossbones and the stark silver. This was a way of boosting morale, of boosting identity, of priming solidarity. The brown shirts were the first organization to be costumed by Hugo Boss. I mean, it's just impossible to imagine, in fact, almost any other historical leader in history going to a catwalk showing of new clothes for the soldiers. Only Hitler, and for reasons unique to him and unique to the Third Reich.
The National Socialists found success in running both well-planned propaganda and brutal acts of violence simultaneously. However, it was the Olympic Games of 1936 which would see a halt to the terror and the suppression of anti-Semitism. Hitler understood the power of the Games and exploited them in order to show Europe and the rest of the world a false image of a peaceful, tolerant Germany. Captain Erich Braun was a spectator at the Games along with his father. It was clear that the Nazi propaganda machine was sending out the message it desired, but it was a black American athlete who stole the show.
I was 17 when we went to the Olympics. It was a wonderful occasion. Of course, to me, the highlight at that time was to see this wonderful athlete, Jesse Owens.
Owens is ahead. Skonberg and Volkswagen fighting.
Who won the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the 100-meter relay, and the long jump. Quite incredible. He was poetry in motion.
The lanky star from Ohio State shatters all existing records as he takes the gold medal in the men's broad jump with a sensational leap of 26 feet, 5 5/16 inches.
Owens in particular was staggered by his reception in Germany as he got off the boat wherever he went. The crowds chanted Owens, Owens all over the place, and for a brief time an American black man was more popular in Nazi Germany than Adolf Hitler himself.
The Olympics had placed Hitler in a favourable light throughout the world. However, once the Games were over, the Nazis would renew their persecution. The Jewish population would soon face a greater terror than they had ever previously suffered. The 1936 Olympics allowed Hitler to project to the world a vision of a tolerant, progressive nation. His popularity within Germany was also rising. Those parts of the nation who were not seen as a threat were being shown that the Nazi Party would deliver on the promises they made. But as with all aspects of the regime, there was a more sinister subplot.
The thing that had led people to vote had been the unemployment problem of the early 1930s and the promise that the Nazis would solve that. Well, they did, with a vengeance.
If anybody was unemployed, or they were rounded up and made, for example, to chop wood, which was given to the elderly or the very poor.
Certainly by 1938, there were 400,000 unemployed in Germany. I mean, it is nothing.
But there were always offers to tempt them to join the Nazi Party. You join the ranks, be paid, be uniformed, seemed quite attractive.
Although it seemed that the whole nation was behind them, the main anti-Semitic message of the Jewish conspiracy was still being played out by the Department of Propaganda.
The idea of a Jewish world conspiracy was not one that was present in more than a very tiny fragment of the German population.
They were successful in business up to a point. They controlled some of the big departmental stores in Germany. But in no sense were they in control of the life of the Weimar state.
In every village, in every town and city are stormtroopers from whose headquarters the local party leader directs his district campaign of terror, marks victims for persecution.
Hitler was keen on keeping the suppression of Jews at the forefront of Nazi policy, as Germany and the German nation were historically not known for their anti-Semitism.
It had been the place that many Jews had gone to from countries that genuinely were anti-Semitic. There's a strong anti-Semitic tradition in Austria, strong anti-Semitism in Romania. Soviet anti-Semitism was always kept under wraps, but it was certainly there. And of course, Polish anti-Semitism, where a very large proportion of Europe's Jews lived.
A young Eric Brown, teaching in Germany, could see from an objective point of view the effect of the Nazis' anti-Semitic policies.
I was very aware of the fact that the Nazi regime was building up into a very, very clamorous political body, and a very ruthless political body too.
The Nazis began to unroll then their own brand of anti-Semitism, radical anti-Semitism.
There was an evil aspect, if you like to put it that way, to the Nazi regime.
On November 7th, 1938, Ernst von Rath, a German diplomat in Paris, was shot by Herschel Grinspan, a young German Jewish man. His motive was a direct response to Nazi anti-Semitism. 2 days later, von Rath was pronounced dead. Orders were given to the SA and SS to take to the streets and destroy all Jewish-owned property and businesses and arrest all Jewish men. The following 2 nights were an orchestrated and systematic series of attacks on Jews throughout Germany. It would become known as Kristallnacht. 91 Jews died and 300,000 were arrested and sent to concentration camps. On November 9th, after a chamber music performance in which he was playing cello, Fritz Lustig returned home.
When I reached home, I saw that there was a great crowd in front of the entrance to the building where our flat was situated. The window had been smashed and the people outside the shop was having themselves freely to any alcoholic drinks that were there. I went up to our flat unmolested, was told by my parents that this crowd had been there for some time and they hadn't in fact set fire to the shop.
Fritz and his father found hideouts at 2 different houses in the suburbs of Berlin. Neither faced arrest, but the events of Kristallnacht were immediately felt.
There were too many Jewish men in Berlin to arrest them all, because in the provinces we knew that there had been no exemptions. I went to my office the next morning. It was a Jewish-owned firm, and when I arrived, I was told that both our boss and his 2 sons had been arrested and put into concentration camps. When I went to the bank, the cashier asked me whether it was true, as he had heard, that my boss had been arrested. And I said, yes, it was true. And he shook his head and said, and I always thought he was an honest man.
I think the German population obviously knew it because it was there happening in front of their eyes. But to them, the stakes were so high in getting their pride back. I think about 80% of them were prepared to put up with anything if they could become what they wanted to be, a proud nation once again.
Hitler commanded his popularity amongst the German nation through a series of non-violent territory gains in the latter half of the 1930s.
Most Germans are terribly anxious. They do not want another war. They're afraid that their cities will be bombed. They don't want to go through another First World War. So there's huge relief when the various crises of the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, Anschluss of Austria in 1938, the Czechoslovak crisis, they're all solved basically without bloodshed. That gains Hitler a reputation and popularity in Germany, but not because he's being militaristic. His idea is to refight the First World War, but on a better basis. So his aim very early on is to conquer Eastern Europe, use it as a kind of breadbasket, as a source of supplies, because one of the reasons why Germany lost in 1914 to 18 is because Germany did not have enough supplies. More than 500,000 Germans died from starvation or malnutrition in the First World War. So he wants to right that wrong.
Although Hitler was remilitarizing at an unprecedented rate, the German nation nor the rest of the world could see war on the horizon.
We did not know how close war was going to be. We did know that the Nazis had started rearming very soon after they came to power.
All the other great powers realized that Germany was rearming in the 1930s. It was secret, of course, until 1935, then declared openly. They had good intelligence on what was going on. But on the other hand, I think a great many politicians abroad had thought it was a bad idea to disarm Germany anyway. A modest rearmament might satisfy German ambitions. They would allow Germany back into the family of nations again.
Everybody who was anti-Nazi thought that the Allies would take steps to prevent further rearmaments, but they never did. The only reason I can think of why they didn't do it, because there was a great anti-war feeling in all those countries. None of the populations in Britain, France, or Poland wanted a war to happen.
I knew there'd be trouble, but I certainly didn't think all-out war.
After the events of Kristallnacht, thousands of Jews had been forced to emigrate, and those that hadn't realized it was time to leave.
After the events of November 1938, it became obvious to everybody, including my parents, that to stay in Germany might be termed suicide, because one could no longer be sure that one's life was not in danger.
Fritz Lustig's parents managed to find refuge in Portugal, where his eldest sister lived. As war became inevitable, Eric Brown had no choice in leaving.
I was asleep on Sunday morning, the 3rd of September, when there was a thunderous knock at the door. When I opened it, there were two SS officers said our countries are at war, which was technically incorrect at 6 o'clock in the morning, because it wasn't until 11 o'clock we were at war. But I didn't think that was a very strong point to argue. And the SS chaps said, you'll have to come with us. So get dressed and get ready.
Eric Brown was detained for 3 days and then dropped at the Swiss border. From here, he made his way back to Britain, where he immediately signed up to the war effort. Having stayed in England in 1936, Fritz Lustig found refuge with the Quaker family with whom he had lodged.
When I emigrated, that was on a transatlantic steamer which was going from Hamburg via Cherbourg in France and Southampton in England. We interlanded in Cherbourg, and this was the first time I was able to walk about without being aware of having to look over my shoulder to see whether anybody was listening to what I said. In other words, to feel free. And that was a marvelous feeling, which I remember to this day.
In just 10 years, Hitler and the Nazis had moved from a marginal fascist party with a small following into a military dictatorship ready to wage full-scale war. The promise of rebuilding Germany and reinstating pride to the nation fueled Hitler's popularity, despite acts of savage violence that left thousands dead and a great deal more seeking refuge in other countries. When the curtain was raised on the theatre of combat, Germany rallied behind their Führer.
The victory over Poland was certainly welcomed because it righted the wrong, as people saw it, of the territorial settlement at the end of the First World War. I think most Germans would have been very happy to leave it at that.
The high point of Hitler's popularity was undoubtedly in the summer of 1940, after the very rapid conquest with relatively little bloodshed.
The victories of 1939, 1940 created what proved to be a short-lived period of absolute mass euphoria in Germany.
One victory after another. All of this is ecstasy because the prophet is what he says he is. He is real. He is an earthly god by this stage. And of course, the trouble is he begins to believe his own mythology.
The beginning of the Second World War would see the decline of Nazi support. It would take a costly and bloody war to end this horrific regime. The 1930s saw Germany turn from a shattered nation into a military powerhouse. It was to wage war on the nations which just 11 years earlier had left Germany a broken country and a population bereft of pride in the wake of World War I. One man created this transformation, Adolf Hitler.
Hitler was one of the few people in Germany who welcomed another war. He wasn't scared.
Hitler's magnetism was not only something which could convince enormous crowds, but was also incredibly powerful, like a potent narcotic.
How did he become the most powerful man in Germany? Who were the Nazis? And how did they reinvigorate this fractured nation?
In Weimar Germany, there was a new kind of energy, very visible on the streets.
They wanted perpetual acclamation. They wanted constant support from the people.
Terror played a very important part in the dictatorship. Nothing would be tolerated that undermined the German national revolution.
Thousands were taken in by one man's magnetism, which proved to be Germany's fatal attraction.
Hitler at this stage sees himself not as the Messiah, but as John the Baptist. It's only at his time in Landsberg prison that he actually realizes, my God, I am he.
To fully understand the doomed love affair of Germany and Hitler, we must first look into the German nation of the late 19th century.
Germany had become the most powerful country, the most prosperous country, the most advanced country on the European continent.
It was a rather authoritarian state on the one hand, but it also had a national parliament with elections, with some limited powers, but those powers are most likely growing.
A highly militarized imperial state under the hereditary monarchy of the Hohenzollern dynasty.
Having given support to the unification of Germany after the Franco-Prussian War, Britain had become fearful of this new power. Its growing industrial and military capability threatened to overshadow Britain's diminishing empire.
After the Franco-Prussian War, Germany powered ahead economically, overtaking Britain as an industrial power by the time of the First World War, second only to the United States.
There was a great deal of catching up to do, a great deal of nation building, of creating unity, of creating vision.
It was ambitious really to join the other great powers as one of the major European imperial states.
Alongside that, both envy and arrogance of the British Empire. It was envy because it was so world powerful. It was 25% of the world's surface and 25% of the world's people. But in addition, a very strong sense of superiority.
Many historians would say a dangerously expansionist power with ambitions in Europe that were certainly threatening to the continuation of any existing balance of power.
It was a mass of seething tensions.
Germany was beginning to be a colonial power late in the race.
It is not in Germany, however, where our story begins, but in neighboring Austria-Hungary.
We don't know much about Hitler's early life. He was born in Braunau on the River Inn on the 20th of April, 1889, the son of a minor Austrian official.
His father wasn't a very nice man, knocked Hitler around a bit. Because of that, Hitler's mother took on a very protective role. We can gather that much.
He had a rather unhappy childhood. He had 4 siblings who died before he was born.
Hitler's childhood leads us to believe it was a fairly ordinary upbringing, comparable with his peers at the time.
A problem for historians is that Hitler reinvented quite a bit about his childhood.
He was an indifferent student, it has to be said. It was not that he was not very intelligent, he certainly was, but he was unable to focus.
Bit of a loner, as he continued to be, but always a voracious reader. He read everything he could get his hands on, continued to do that.
He created, in a sense, a kind of self-education, which was a bizarre bricolage of all kinds of sources of his own authorship. In other words, what he didn't get was really a coherent education because he didn't pay attention.
In 1907, a young Adolf Hitler made his way to Vienna to pursue a career as an artist. Vienna at the time was the city leading Europe in new artistic practice and philosophical thought. Hitler's plan was to apply and enroll at the Academy of Fine Arts.
He went to Vienna when he was about 16 and really knocked around, didn't do a lot. He never lived as rough as he later claimed.
He was rejected from art school, I think probably rightly, looking at his artworks. He knew about art in general terms. He knew about neoclassical art. He knew the power of art above all, that great historic images had enormous moments. So although his watercolours didn't advance the Nazi cause, he knew what art could do.
Hitler claimed throughout his life that he was an artist who was torn from his easel by the love of Germany.
His mother was generous to him. She provided him with a series of allowances, possibly without the knowledge of his father. So some biographers of Hitler say that he was really a bit of a layabout. He frequented cafe society in Vienna and met up with a deeply flawed cafe intelligentsia who fed him a lot of the ideas that Hitler later said in Mein Kampf became the granite foundations of my thought.
Everyone assumes that Hitler was strongly influenced by Austrian anti-Semitism. There was a lot of it around before 1914, but actually it's very hard to pin down that he was influenced by it.
All of the associations with Jewish people, with whom there are a great many in Hitler's early life, were not merely positive but benevolent. The doctor who treated his mother when she was sick, the family doctor who treated all of them, he was Jewish. The dealer who bought and sold the paintings Hitler painted in Vienna to keep the wolf from the door, again was Jewish.
In receipt of the inheritance bequeathed to Hitler from his father's estate, and finding little fortune as an artist in Vienna, Hitler decided to move to Munich in 1913.
Hitler was very conscious of being ethnically German.
As a German nationalist, Hitler believed that he belonged more in Germany than in Austria.
Austria-Hungary remained a great power in the scheme of things, dominating a large part of southeastern Europe.
But it was getting into crisis because of the growth of nationalism, Czech nationalism, Hungarian, South Slav, and the clash of these national groups in the parliamentary assemblies made the parliament, the Reichsrat, and its Hungarian equivalent more or less unworkable, ungovernable. Every meeting just erupted into shouting matches between the different national groups, either in Austria or in Hungary. And that, I think, gave Hitler a contempt for parliamentary rule. He saw it as being ineffective. He saw the empire as this large, ramshackle organization, and he thought that an authoritarian director, strong leadership, even a dictator, was the only way to solve these problems.
It was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo that would be the catalyst for the start of the First World War. Within weeks, Austria-Hungary were at war with Serbia. Germany then mobilized, invaded Luxembourg and Belgium, and began to march on France. This prompted Britain to declare war on Germany. Hitler, although an Austrian citizen living in Munich at the time, managed to sign up to the German army.
In the chaos of mobilization in August 1914, his papers were kind of disregarded, and he got into the army.
The Austrian authorities were after him. He'd eluded conscription from the Austrian army and was living in Germany. He didn't want to fight for something he didn't believe in, and he certainly didn't believe in the Habsburgs and in their empire.
With war erupting all over Europe, Germany would arrive in the position of fighting a war on two fronts. To the east, against the Russians, and to the west, against Britain, France, and Belgium. Hitler had joined the army in support of the German Empire. The experience of war would change the trajectory of his life and in turn the lives of millions of others forever. Having failed as an artist, Hitler found himself in Munich, a city in the modern German Empire. He signed up to the German army and was sent to the Western Front. Here he found Germany at war with Britain and its allies.
Adolf Hitler played but an obscure part, a corporal in the German army.
Hitler was fascinated by the prospect of war.
The First World War turned a nobody into a somebody.
On the whole, most reports show that he was a good soldier, well disciplined. He was promoted to an NCO rank.
He survived it from start to finish. Now, of course, not everybody did.
He served as a battalion runner, close enough to the front line, though he didn't spend as much time as a frontline combat infantry soldier as he later claimed, but he was in danger. He was within firing range of British and French artillery. Because at the very least, if you're a runner, you had to get messages up to communications trenches. And he was seriously gassed in 1918.
People have tried to belittle what he did in the war, actually, but he won the Iron Cross Second Class and then the Iron Cross First Class.
On the recommendation, ironically, of a Jewish superior officer.
This idea that he was some kind of coward is rubbish. He actually manifested enormous courage.
But messengers were often regarded by the fighting troops as having a rather a cushy time.
The enigma is why he was never promoted an officer, of course.
Maybe apocryphal, but I think it's been said that he remained a corporal because he didn't have leadership qualities.
Hitler does not seem to have been well-liked or well-respected by his fellow soldiers. He was a bit of a loner, regarded as a bit of an eccentric. He himself looked back on the First World War as a time of unity, fellow feeling, brotherhood, and so on, and mythologized it in his own mind until he came to want to recreate the spirit of 1914 when all Germans united behind the Kaiser in the Third Reich in 1933.
Russia mobilized its military and defeated Austria-Hungary, but was stopped in Prussia by the German forces. Germany, being the far stronger military power, forced the Bolsheviks to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Baltic states were given to Germany, along with the recognized independence of Ukraine.
Early in 1918, they had actually signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Russia, and so they'd acquired an empire in Russia.
The dreaded two-front war now no longer existed from March 1918. So that was taken as a sign that Germany was doing really well in the war, and it all hung on the Western Front. But with the United States in the war, Germany wasn't going to win on the Western Front.
Swiftly, the menace of war grew into dread reality as American ships and ships carrying American citizens were torpedoed, sent to the bottom by the ruthless campaign of the unseen tigers of the sea.
America entered the war after Germany had started attacking all commercial ships heading for Britain, which had meant the sinking of American ships in the North Atlantic. On April 6, 1917, America declared war on Germany. With the superior resources the Americans brought, the German army faced an impossible situation. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed, which ended the war.
The problem was that the political and military establishment had not led Germans to expect defeat.
It's all near the end, and their press are not telling them just how effective the counterattack of the Allies has been.
Propaganda was still being pumped out saying that they were going to win. So in late October, when they finally conceded defeat and began to sue for peace, this came as a terrible shock. It was very, very sudden to most Germans. And then on top of that, there were the armistice terms, and then even more, the peace terms in 1919, which almost all Germans regarded with absolute outrage.
The Treaty of Versailles was a series of provisions and conditions placed on Germany by the Allied nations. One of these being Germany accepting the responsibility for all loss and damage caused by the war. This was known as Article 231, which later became known as the War Guilt Clause. The treaty also forced Germany to make substantial territorial concessions and pay reparations to the Allied countries. In addition, Germany was only allowed a military force of no more than 100,000 men.
Versailles was, to them, the stab in the back. What they'd given was an armistice, not a surrender.
The Germans had to surrender their combat aircraft. They weren't allowed to build any combat ships. Their army was restricted to 100,000.
100,000 seems quite a lot to me, actually. That this meant all the cooks and bottle washers and pen pushers were counted in the 100,000 men. It wasn't 100,000 fighting men.
They had to pay massive financial reparations for the damage that German troops had caused in the occupation of northern France and southern Belgium. And they rested on the war guilt clause, which almost all Germans disputed. Germany had not been guilty for starting the First World War. It had been caused by the encirclement of Germany by the Allies.
They felt that the Allies had deceived them, had abandoned all notions of honor by treating them as a conquered people when they didn't think they were. The things that had been promised to them, specifically by President Woodrow Wilson and David Lloyd George, had not been delivered. Instead, they'd been violated, their honor had been degraded.
A very large proportion of them felt a very great deal of resentment against the rest of the world.
Hitler was devastated by that, like huge numbers of Germans.
Hitler, like many others, couldn't explain it, had to find some way of explaining it to himself. And like tens of thousands of others, he blamed the home front. He blamed socialists, Marxists, Jews, people who undermined Germany from within.
The stab-in-the-back theory surfaced in right-wing circles after the end of the war as a way to explain the sudden defeat. It was believed that the left-wing Republican and Jewish populations of Germany, who had made up the home front, had lost the war from within.
Most Germans did not believe in the stab-in-the-back legend. The independent Social Democrats and the mainstream Social Democrats and then the Communist Party in the early 20s were a major part of the German political system, about a third of the electorate. So this belief in the stab in the back and the Jewish conspiracy in 1918 to 19 was very much a lunatic fringe group on the right.
The First World War had seen the young Hitler in a role which suited him. However, the sudden loss for Germany was too much to take, not only for Hitler, but for the entire population. This, along with the humiliation of Versailles, Hitler and a dangerous minority of the right-wing population looked for a scapegoat. The search would see the birth of a new party and bring together some of the most dangerous men Germany has ever produced. The shock defeat of Germany in World War I left the nation humiliated. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles saddled Germany with being responsible for rebuilding the Allied nations. Added to this, Germany had seen its own revolution in 1918. However, it was not until 1919 that the Weimar Republic was established, with the coming together of a national assembly in Weimar, a town in central Germany.
Germany had to pay reparations to the victorious Allies. This was really what accelerated the great inflation. It started in 1916 when the German government started printing money to fund the war effort. And as we know, printing money causes inflation. Post-war German governments didn't make the slightest effort to arrest inflation. They could pin that on the peace treaties and on the Allies. It got so out of hand in 1923, the Allies stepped in, the Americans stepped in, particularly with the Dawes Plan.
The Dawes and Young plans to schedule Germany's reparations payments are evolved, and they fail.
The Dawes Plan was the brainchild of the American banker Charles G. Dawes. The plan was to lend the German government the money to pay back the reparations which had not been given to the Allied countries.
America stabilized the German currency so that the Americans could give loans to Germany so that Germany could pay reparations to Britain, France, and others, so that Britain, France, and others could repay loans to the United States.
During this time of change and uncertainty, Hitler was keen to continue in the vocation which had given him personal success. After the war ended, he stayed in the German army, which was vastly depleted.
He didn't want to leave. He liked the army. Whatever inventions he may have resorted to about his own service, he felt at home within the secure structures and hierarchies of the army.
He attended the courses for soldiers at Camp Lechfeld. These courses were taught, some of them by the most famous academics of the era, and what they retailed was a dart of sturdy German ethno-nationalism and patriotism. They're a way of combating the activities of the Bolsheviks.
Right-wing political propaganda masquerading as political education.
Hitler proved not only a worthy pupil, but he actually became one of them. He was recruited to actually do this speech-making, this kind of incendiary pedagogy himself, and proved remarkably good at it. It's there that he learns his oratorical techniques.
He was actually sent by the army, to which he still belonged, to observe a far-right group called the German Workers' Party.
The German Workers' Party was a group founded in Munich in January 1919 by Anton Drexler, a leading member of the occultist Thule Society. The party would meet regularly and discuss ideas of nationalism. The binding ideas of the German Workers' Party were entrenched in racism and the hatred of Jews. It was during this period of observation that Hitler became more and more involved with the party's politics.
He started speaking in its meetings and soon became clear that he was a very gifted speaker and took on board very much these radical anti-Semitic ideas in which the war had been lost by some conspiracy he imagined the Jews had been undertaking against Germany.
Hitler, it's been said, had a mind a bit like a hoover. He just sucked up and absorbed everything he read. People like Adolf Lanz, a practicing racist and a teacher of really bastardized Darwinism.
There's a whole kind of mishmash of ideas that he puts together to form the National Socialist ideology.
Having shown his strength as a public speaker, Hitler began to take a bigger role in the German Workers' Party. He took on more responsibility, soon becoming the head of propaganda.
He starts not as leader, that remains Anton Drexler, but as their PR man. And what he does is produce these amazing, inflammatory, exciting posters and have these mass meetings, which increasingly large numbers of people come to.
In 1920, Hitler decided to rename the German Workers' Party in an attempt to broaden its appeal. He called it the National Socialist German Workers' Party. A year later, after an angry dispute which saw him threaten to leave the party, Hitler was named president. Now he would start to gather around him a loyal, intelligent, and brutal inner circle.
In a situation of great post-war turmoil in Bavaria and Germany as a whole, rampant inflation, unemployment, street disturbances, strikes, militant political action by workers and by the left. So Hitler was certainly looking for a political home, and he appears to have found one.
Hitler also gathered around him, bit by bit, as his reputation as a speaker of the radical right increased, a group of acolytes, a group of disciples who brought their own particular techniques and their own ideas, personalities, and reputation.
Hitler's closest ally at the time was Rudolf Hess, who had been born on April 26, 1894 in Alexandria, Egypt.
Like Hitler, he had this extraordinary reaction at the end, you know, that how could we have lost and so on, who was there to blame. He drifted off into university life, but he was a frustrated, radical nationalist. And when he met Hitler, he was absolutely transfixed by him.
Hess saw, again, international politics and this notion of sort of struggle between different races. And he was a fanatical admirer of Hitler's. You can see it in the films that were taken of him at Nuremberg rallies, his face just glowing with naive enthusiasm.
The most decorated of Hitler's men was Hermann Goering from Rosenheim, Bavaria, born January 12, 1893.
Goering was an unusual recruit to the infant National Socialist Party.
At that time, in the 20s, a very dashing figure with a big military reputation.
He'd been quite a distinguished Air Force pilot during the First World War.
He had succeeded Baron von Richthofen as head of the von Richthofen squadron after the shooting down of the Red Baron. So he was an amazingly glamorous figure, and he maintained this astonishing persona of the jolly ex-fighter pilot, which the German people found adorable.
He was not the kind of person who gravitated easily to these radical political movements. But Goering, too, had thought that Hitler somehow or other articulated his own sense of resentment and loss and became a committed follower from that point on.
One of the party's most sinister figures was Heinrich Himmler, from a Roman Catholic middle-class family, born October 7th, 1900 in Munich.
Himmler's father was a teacher who'd been actually tutor to the Bavarian royal family. Himmler had something rather schoolmasterly about him.
Heinrich Himmler's life was really dominated by the fact that he wanted to fight in the First World War, but was too young. You always had that sense with Himmler that he was frustrated in not being able to fight on Germany's behalf.
He had this very pedagogic, kind of scholarly, dreamy manner. Of course, we know now what was going on inside him.
He was a rather eccentric patriot, a strong anti-Semite, and he gravitated towards National Socialism because it seemed for him the natural home.
Martin Bormann became Hitler's most trusted disciple, the son of a post office worker, born June 17, 1900.
Bormann is very much the sinister Machiavellian manipulator, of course.
Very soon joined one of the Free Corps, the vigilante groups that grew up in Germany in the early 1920s, was sent to prison for murdering somebody. When he emerged, he again heard Hitler and thought, well, you know, this man articulates the things I feel, the resentment I feel, the loss in 1918 that all Germans shared. And he too became a devoted follower.
Der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches.
Finally, arguably the most intelligent of Hitler's men, Joseph Goebbels from the Ruhr Valley, born October 29, 1897.
Goebbels was something of an oddball in the National Socialist movement. He had a university education, he got a doctorate, he studied German literature in the 19th century.
He's also a romantic nationalist and writes a novel before even knowing Hitler called Michael, which is absolutely a description of a Hitler-type figure.
This idea that Hitler had of a Germany where all Germans were united on an equal basis had a very powerful appeal to Goebbels.
And he was looking for a political movement that somehow represented his personal position. He became a good recruit for the National Socialist movement.
And a supreme ability to organize propaganda in the most ruthless possible way.
The common feelings of loss, despair, frustration and anger from losing the First World War united these men. However, these were not uncommon sentiments in Germany at the time. Something else activated and fueled their extremism. All had experienced some kind of revelation whilst listening to Hitler.
He seemed to be an outsider, somebody almost sent to Germany to help Germany regain its trajectory to great power status, to help Germany revenge itself on the Allies.
He was fulfilling a kind of prefigured role which had always existed in German history and culture. Kaiser Frederick Barbarossa, King Redbeard, the man who would deliver Germany from her enemies. And specifically now, those enemies were gathering thick and furious round them.
For Hitler, all the signs were pointing towards a burgeoning National Socialist political party. He had managed to gather around him a loyal following, and some meetings were running into the thousands. It was events in Italy, however, which ignited Hitler's imagination. They would have huge consequences on the fate of Hitler, the National Socialist Party, and the rest of the German nation. Hitler had gathered some of the brightest and most dangerous men from the far right. His National Socialist meetings often brought in around 2,000 participants. But Hitler's perception of himself and his party was grossly exaggerated.
He's the kind of man in a dirty raincoat standing on a soapbox in the middle of a town square talking to half a dozen people.
Standing on platforms, on street corners and so on, old-fashioned kind of political activity.
There were other far more powerful, far more publicly visible right-wing parties in Germany at the time.
Well, it really was just an assembly of people who come together who shared roughly the same kinds of views.
Events in Italy inspired Hitler.
The bombastic newspaper editor with a gladiator's jaw led his black-shirted legions in a march on Rome.
In October 1922, the fascist leader Mussolini and his black shirt army marched on Rome. King Victor Emmanuel III was forced to hand control of Italy to Mussolini. At least this is how Hitler saw it, and almost immediately began to plot his own coup.
Hitler was very influenced in 1983 by the successful coup staged by Mussolini.
Hitler conceived the idea of a march on Berlin.
So he began to fantasize in 1923 that the German state was so weak, the height of the inflation, the crisis and so on.
He took advantage of the disintegration of German politics in 1923 under the pressures of hyperinflation, the French occupation of the Ruhr to seize reparations which weren't being delivered, to stage a coup d'etat in Munich.
Mussolini was also well aware of the power of propaganda. He knew how he wished to be perceived by the rest of Europe.
Hitler was one of the victims of Mussolini's propaganda. King appointed Mussolini head of government in a perfectly constitutional way. It was not a coup d'etat. It was a perfectly constitutional act on the part of the king, if a rather weak-willed one.
It was all a bit of a gamble from Hitler's point of view.
On November 8, 1923, Hitler, along with 600 stormtroopers, surrounded the Burger Braukeller, a large beer hall in Munich. Here, the State Commissioner of Bavaria, Gustav von Kahr, was holding a meeting of around 3,000 people. Hitler marched in, fired a shot into the air, and announced that the revolution had broken out and no one could leave. Overnight, Hitler attempted to take power from von Kahr, but failed. It was decided early in the morning of November 9th that they would march out of the beer hall towards the Bavarian Ministry of Defense. On the way, they were confronted by the Bavarian police.
Hitler hoped that the new German army, the post-imperial creation of the Reichswehr, would support them.
It wasn't backed by the army, the industrial elites refused to support it, the civil service regarded it with contempt.
When the Munich police opened fire, most of them turned tail. Some of them were hit, some wounded, a few killed. But it was built up into an iconic episode in the history of the movement.
Hitler was arrested, put on trial.
His trial began on February 26, 1924, and ended on the 1st of April. Other conspirators, such as Rudolf Hess, were also arrested and tried in court. The whole episode seemed to be a complete failure on the part of Hitler and the National Socialist Party.
What the beer hall putsch does, which is marvelous for the Nazis, is provide them with martyrs and provide them with a myth, a legend, and a whole new symbol structure. For example, the blood flag, which is the flag carried on that very day and when they fall, is after that time the core sacramental edifice of the Nazi process, so that at Nuremberg all of the standards of the stormtroopers are touched by the blood flag. The martyrs are symbolically reburied in vast marble sarcophagi in the center of Munich after the Nazis take power. And every year there is the famous reenactment of the Putsch, where they march down the streets. There is a death watch held throughout Germany the night before. There are radio link-ups. Everything is broadcast, great films, smoldering beers, flames, the whole work. And if it sounds quasi-religious, it is.
The Nazi flag, the swastika, which Hitler purported to have designed himself, was taken from an ancient symbol embodying early Aryan history.
The swastika is an ancient Buddhist symbol. You see it all over India and China. And it has always been around. It was originally a symbol of the sun. But it began to be acquired by the German Reich in the late 19th century as one of their symbols, because they felt it stood for the idea of being an Aryan.
It was Hitler's changes to the design which marks it out as the Nazi symbol.
The story he tells is that he invited people to submit designs, and swastikas came in, and none of them, he said, quite did the job, so he said, I'll do it myself, and that's what he worked on. It's a series of simple design formulae which are applied to it.
The flag is in the colours of red, black and white, which are the old imperial colours, to contrast with the red, gold and black of the Republic.
What he did very brilliantly, and I'm somewhat reluctant to say this, it's a fantastic piece of graphic design. He took it, he rotated it to give it a sense of dynamism. He then calculated the widths of the bars very brilliantly. He then set it in this circle, and it doesn't quite touch the edges, which gives it a kind of vibration and dynamism, and then this red outer bit.
So in all the aesthetic, there's a massive amount of red to stand for the Socialist Party.
And it just goes poof. And by the 1920s, it had become the authorized symbol. He said it was going to be the Nazi symbol, and it was the Nazi symbol.
At his trial, Hitler had taken sole responsibility for the putsch. It is reported that the judges found it hard not to acquit Hitler due to their pro-Nazi sympathies. Finally, the sentence of 5 years of confinement was passed. He was also banned from public speaking, testament to the fact that his oratory was a key factor in the rise of the National Socialist Party. The enforced silence and confinement gave Hitler time for introspection. The outlet for his thoughts now came through the pen.
The German state, the Bible of the Nazis.
He didn't actually think until the Putsch, it doesn't seem to us, that he was the chosen one, he was the Messiah. It's only at his time in Landsberg prison that he actually realizes, my God, I am he, and is somehow liberated into becoming what he does in fact become.
He served less than a year of his sentence. He served with Rudolf Hess, amongst others, and he used the time to write Mein Kampf.
Democracy is a monstrosity, born of filth and fire.
It's interesting that Hitler decided when he was sent off to prison in 1924 that he would take this opportunity to sit back and write a book about his experiences, how he'd reached the point he'd reached, why he had the beliefs that he did. But it was very important for him to do that, I think, to sit back and take stock of, how he'd arrived there.
Hitler's title for the original manuscript was My 4.5-year Struggle Against Lies, Cowardice and Stupidity, a final reckoning with those who would destroy the German nation. Well, his publishers recommended to him he go for something that might be a little snappier and catchier for the market, so they extrapolated the two words, my struggle, Mein Kampf.
The really interesting part of it is the famous 5th chapter, which is a theory of propaganda. The rest of it are really a collation of emotional spasms. It's not a recipe for a system as, for example, Marx is with the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital.
God has made Germans a race of supermen. Almighty God, bless our German blood.
The publishers shifted 300,000 copies, and many more, for perhaps obvious reasons after that. Big book, the original thing, hefty volume. You're talking about 600 pages.
The writing of Mein Kampf fueled his desire for power and the need to lead Germany. However, Hitler knew he would need a different route to domination, but without being able to speak publicly, it would have to wait.
Stopping him from speaking was going to keep the peace. He was regarded as an influential speaker.
I think if we're looking for an explanation for why it took a long time for the party to revive again and for the public to really take Hitler seriously again, it was the ban on his speaking.
He alone in Germany is not allowed to speak. So used that as propaganda, really, to attack the Weimar government for censorship.
Was hier steht, ist keine Redezeit.
In 1927, the ban on Hitler's public speaking was relaxed and later lifted completely. Once more, Hitler took to the stage.
Something about his performances, something about that which really attracted people, you know, like modern-day pop stars.
There were people who do appear to have been mesmerized by him.
As soon as he could start speaking, you have that run up to the successful parliamentary elections in the late 1920s. When I look at Hitler on a stage, I think of him as being in a political theatre, but I don't believe that what he says is great oratory.
At the time of Hitler's silence, Germany began to see a certain recovery. Thanks to American investment, unemployment was declining and the economy was improving. A sense of optimism rippled through the German nation.
A lot of Americans invested, so Germany looked as if it was prospering by 1928.
The National Socialists could have been banished to the history books as a marginal far-right political party, with their eccentric leader and the failed beer hall putsch of 1923. However, fate dealt them a favorable hand.
The post-war economic recovery under the Weimar Republic, which was genuine enough while it lasted, that had collapsed as a direct result of the Wall Street crash in New York.
It was a saying of the time, New York sneezed, London caught cold, and Germany nearly died of influenza.
The implications of the crash would eventually lead the National Socialist Party to total power.
The continuity of the Great Depression was absolutely critical. 7 million men became unemployed. There seemed to be no lifting. And once you got the worker in the dole queue, you had him as a potential Nazi, a potential stormtrooper.
What further measures would be imposed on the German population to consolidate the Nazis' power, and what terror would be unleashed before the dramatic toppling of this evil regime?